On a furnace-bright afternoon in July 1944, the gates of Camp Lordsburg, New Mexico, clanged shut behind a column of Japanese prisoners just off the train, many from shattered units on Saipan. Heat rolled off the yard, dust lifting around their boots and catching in throats dry from travel. In training, instructors had promised that surrender meant hunger, blows, and a slow disappearance behind foreign wire. And those words marched beside them now as guards steered the column toward the mess compound. The low sheds and canvas awnings looked bare, and the men told themselves that American stores must be thin if captives were kept here. Near the wooden tables outside the field kitchen, however, something did not fit any rumor they had heard. A steel dispenser, beaded with condensation, filled with an opaque yellow liquid. Some whispered that it was a cleaning fluid. Others scoffed that Americans were soft enough to drink childish sweets in wartime. When a U.S. sergeant worked the tap and let the liquid run into tin cups, prisoners accepted them out of obligation, lifting the metal to their lips with open suspicion. The first mouthful cut through every expectation sharp and sour, cold against cracked tongues, with a sweetness almost forgotten after island rations. Within minutes, the same men who had mocked the drink were drifting back into line, cups outstretched, realizing that this frivolous lemonade was the first sign that captivity in America would not match the nightmare they had been taught to expect in the years before any Japanese prisoner lifted a tin cup of American lemonade. Their expectations of captivity had already been sealed by doctrine, repetition, and fear. From 1937 onward, Imperial Army training manuals warned that a soldier who surrendered forfeited not only honor but the right to sustenance. And countless company lectures insisted that enemy camps would offer little more than thin gruel and degrading labor. Propaganda reinforced these lessons with stark imagery, portraying the United States as a nation of indulgence, flush with gadgets and amusements, yet supposedly short on real discipline and wartime resolve. Even as American industry expanded at unprecedented scale, Japanese troops were told that their opponents survived on artificial stimulants and sugary concoctions because they lacked the hard endurance forged by rice, barley, and rationed fish. By the time men were captured on Saipan, Guam, or isolated garrisons in the Gilberts, most had not seen fresh citrus in months, and few imagined a front line where cold-flavored drinks were anything more than a childish luxury. When transport to mainland camps began in mid-1944, these assumptions met a different reality. The trains that carried prisoners across California's fields and the Southwest's orchards exposed them to a country whose agricultural and industrial networks dwarfed Japan's wartime capacity. Seasonal fruit harvests fed canneries. Canneries supplied depots. Depots stocked even remote POW camps with items unfamiliar to men shaped by scarcity. Thus, when lemonade appeared in the desert, it represented more than refreshment. It marked the first collision between the mythology of American weakness and the material strength that underpinned U.S. logistics. That contrast leads directly into the broader question of how the United States produced, packaged, and delivered such beverages on a global scale. In the summer of 1942, as American mobilization accelerated beyond anything the world had yet seen, the Quartermaster Corps finalized a small but significant item in its expanding nutritional arsenal: lemon powder. Designed to deliver reliable vitamin C across continents and climates, it became a standardized component of U.S. rations through 1945, each packet blended dehydrated lemon crystals, citric acid, cane sugar, and measured amounts of ascorbic acid. Its formulation calculated to dissolve instantly in cold water, an advantage for units without boilers or with only limited fuel. Packed in bulk tins or cartons filled with dozens of individual envelopes, the powder required no more equipment than a steel pitcher, a mixing paddle, and access to a water drum. American plants in New Jersey, Illinois, and California produced millions of servings annually, with some facilities outputting several tons every month to supply stateside bases, Pacific staging areas, and labor detachments scattered across the Southwest. Its bright color and sharp flavor were products of concentration methods uncommon in Japan, where citrus remained limited, largely seasonal, and rarely industrially processed. Soldiers raised on weak tea, barley water, or rationed canteen refills found the American mixture almost foreign in intensity, a drink that tasted more like an engineered stimulant than something drawn from fruit. For Japanese prisoners who later encountered it, this vivid sweetness seemed to confirm their long-held belief that Americans leaned on artificial energy rather than discipline, yet the very simplicity that made it appear unnatural, just powder, water, and a quick stir, so explains why it became one of the most widespread beverages in US camps. Understanding this technical backbone clarifies how the lemonade flowed so easily through American supply channels before reaching the men, who would eventually rethink their initial scorn by the summer of 1943. Long before any prisoner ever tasted it, lemonade had already become a quiet fixture of American military life, spreading first across the sprawling training grounds of Texas, Kansas, and Georgia, on the rifle ranges of Fort Benning, where dust drifted in pale sheets across the berms and the air pulsed with heat rising off red soil. Instructors kept steel pitchers filled with the bright mixture to push recruits through hours of marksmanship drills. Aircrew trainees and California men learning navigation, gunnery, and long-endurance flights drank it by the gallon during ground school sessions, its sharp acidity encouraging steady hydration in climates where heat exhaustion remained a constant threat. Quartermaster reports from these camps praised the powder for its speed. A few seconds of stirring turned cold water from a tanker into a dependable source of vitamin C, allowing entire companies to refill canteens without slowing the day's schedule. Overseas, its reach widened as American forces pushed deeper into the Pacific. Crates of lemon powder traveled with Sarration and beer ration supplies to Hawaii, Australia, and forward air bases from Espiritu Santo to the Gilberts, where fresh produce was scarce and the risk of scurvy still lingered among construction units. Engineers carving airstrips from coral often relied on the drink as their only flavored relief, its sweetness cutting through the taste of iodine tablets in their water. Japanese troops who later overran isolated American stores on early island battlefields occasionally found these packets and dismissed them as frivolous stimulants for soft troops. Proof so, they believed that American strength depended on comforts rather than discipline. Yet that assumption would erode quickly once those same men, now captured and transported across the ocean, began receiving the very beverage they had mocked, setting the stage for a confrontation between battlefield myth and the logistical reality of American abundance. By the opening months of 1944, Japanese intelligence officers found themselves sifting through a growing pile of small but persistent references to what they termed American energy drinks. Reports came from every corner of the Pacific. Lemon-colored powders recovered from abandoned dumps on Guadalcanal, tins scattered in supply caves on Makin, and partially dissolved residues discovered in captured canteens. None of these items matched anything in Japanese field rations, and their vivid sweetness intrigued analysts who already believed that the United States relied on artificial stimulants to push its troops through tropical hardship. Interrogations of the few Americans taken alive only muddied the picture further, with several insisting, truthfully, that citrus beverages were a daily staple across U.S. formations. 2 staff officers in Tokyo. This pattern suggested an army dependent on sugar to maintain morale, a force cushioned by indulgence and incapable of enduring long operations without manufactured comforts. Such conclusions filtered rapidly into frontline rumor. Soldiers on New Britain or in the Marshalls repeated claims that Americans drank childlike mixtures to disguise the flavor of their water. And when Japanese troops tasted the remains of lemon powder in captured gear, many found the sweetness disconcerting, almost theatrical compared to their own austerity. Yet the deeper the war cut into Japan's supply capacity, the more unsettling the contrast became. Men who once dismissed the beverage as proof of American softness began quietly wondering how an enemy could afford such luxuries on remote atolls while they struggled to secure rice, salt, or dried fish. These shifting impressions traveled with the survivors of Saipan into captivity, primed to collide with the reality of American abundance. Their arrival in U.S. camps would reveal how industrial power, not softness, made such widespread distribution possible, a realization that reshaped their understanding of the enemy they had fought.
By mid-90s, the quiet force behind America's ability to offer lemonade to tens of thousands of POWs was already in motion, spread across a logistics network whose scale few Japanese soldiers could have imagined. Processing plants in Newark, Chicago, and Oakland drew on enormous domestic citrus harvests from California's Central Valley and the Gulf states, drying and mixing thousands of pounds of lemon powder every month. From each factory, freight cars carried the bright tins along rail corridors that laced the interior of the continent, converging on quartermaster depots in Kansas City, Dallas, and Denver. There, clerks broke down bulk shipments into balanced loads destined for training divisions, staging centers, and hundreds of fixed installations, including the growing network of POW camps scattered across New Mexico, Colorado, and Wisconsin. Because the powder stored compactly and resisted spoilage, depots treated it as a routine hydration item rather than a luxury, sending it onward in the same shipments that moved flour, canned meat, and medical supplies. Mess sergeants at remote posts could rely on it through the hottest months, mixing gallons at a time with nothing more than cold water and a paddle. Even when priorities shifted toward frontline units in 1944, the system proved resilient enough to keep stateside camps fully stocked. For Japanese prisoners who arrived from a homeland suffering acute ration failures and collapsing transport networks, the steady appearance of such shipments was disorienting. Every new crate of supplies underscored an industrial imbalance far greater than anything wartime propaganda had acknowledged. This logistical foundation brings the narrative to the threshold of the prisoner's first direct encounter with the drink itself, when abstract impressions of American abundance suddenly became real. In the heat-stunned weeks after the Marianas Campaign, the first large groups of Japanese prisoners began arriving at camps across the American Southwest, where their earliest encounters with lemonade took place. At Camp Lordsburg, the noon meal often coincided with a dry wind rolling off the desert, carrying grit that clung to uniforms still marked by the fighting on Saipan. Mess personnel, following routine rather than ceremony, filled galvanized dispensers with bright yellow lemonade mixed hours earlier in the field kitchen. The sight alone unsettled many prisoners. Conditioned by years of warnings that captivity meant starvation or humiliation, they assumed the liquid was medicine, cleanser, or some unnecessary American indulgence offered as a deception. Several men stepped back from the tables, muttering inwardly that the enemy wasted sugar on theatrics, while real armies conserved strength through austerity. Yet, heat and uncertainty wore down resistance. A few prisoners, exhausted from transport, and unable to ignore the cold condensation gathering on the steel dispenser, lifted their cups and tasted the mixture. The reaction spread wordlessly. The sharp acidity, the sweetness unfamiliar after months of rationed barley and rice, and the sheer coldness of the drink cut through the dust and fatigue in a way none expected. Within hours, the line lengthened, as men who had mocked the drink returned for refills. Stepping forward with the awkwardness of those who feared their interest would be noticed, the shift left many unsettled, for it revealed the first tangible crack in their assumptions about American scarcity. What they had dismissed as wasteful softness was now part of a daily reality that challenged years of instruction. From this moment, the pattern repeated across other camps, drawing the narrative toward the broader integration of lemonade into POW life. As the flow of Japanese prisoners broadened across the United States in late 1944 and early 1945, the experience first tasted in the deserts of New Mexico began repeating itself in new landscapes, each camp offering its own version of the same quiet revelation. At Camp Clarinda in Iowa, where work detachments spent long days harvesting corn or hoeing soybeans under an immense Midwestern sky, prisoners returned, dusty and spent, to find galvanized dispensers waiting beside the barracks. The lemonade inside, mixed that morning to combat the rising summer heat, struck many as implausibly generous after hours of labor in fields that resembled the American heartland seen only in propaganda sketches. Hundreds of miles south, at Camp Rohor in Arkansas, the climate reshaped the encounter once again. Humidity lay thick over the pine forests, insects swarmed at dusk, and outdoor labor drained strength quickly. Mess halls compensated by preparing larger batches of lemonade, encouraging steady hydration during the most oppressive months. And guards later remarked on how quickly Japanese work crews emptied the dispensers before returning to their tasks. Even in cooler regions, such as Wisconsin's Camp McCoy, the pattern held during the warmer stretches of spring and summer. Prisoners found lemonade served at Sunday meals, its presence treated as routine rather than indulgence. Across these sites, from the plains of Iowa to the forests of Arkansas and the northern training grounds of Wisconsin, the beverage slowly shifted from an object of suspicion to a familiar comfort. Quartermasters noted its rapid consumption and the consistency with which prisoners sought it during rest breaks, evidence that the drink had become woven into camp life. The uniformity of this practice underscored a logistical reliability far beyond anything the prisoners had known in Japan's collapsing wartime economy. These accumulating encounters prepared them for deeper psychological changes that would shape the remainder of their captivity. For many of the prisoners, the steady appearance of lemonade became a quiet but powerful challenge to the worldview they had carried into captivity. Years of indoctrination had insisted that the United States was decadent yet materially fragile, a nation incapable of sustaining its forces without indulgent stimulants. Yet every time the dispensers were filled day after day, camp after camp, that narrative weakened. Men who had expected thin rations and calculated deprivation now confronted a routine in which a sweet chilled beverage was offered without hesitation, even to captives. The contrast with conditions they had endured in Japan was stark. Citrus shortages had grown severe by 1944, and many soldiers arrived in American hands, suffering from the early signs of deficiency after months of relying on rice, barley, and dwindling stocks of dried fish. The lemonade's sharp brightness touched memories of peacetime flavors, long erased by the austerity of total war, stirring a mixture of relief and discomfort among men who had prepared themselves for humiliation. As the weeks lengthened, prisoners began to interpret the drink in broader terms. Some recognized in its abundance a material strength far greater than wartime propaganda had admitted, evidence that the enemy's supply lines reached effortlessly from factory to field. Others saw in its casual distribution a signal that starvation and mistreatment were not part of their captors' intentions, easing the fear that had shaped their first moments behind the wire. This gradual reframing softened resistance to camp routines, encouraging cooperation and reducing the tension that had defined their earliest days. The emotional shift created by something as simple as a flavored drink pointed toward larger strategic implications, laying the groundwork for how small comforts would influence the management and morale of POW populations in the months ahead. By 1945, the lemonade served in POW camps carried no tactical function in the conventional sense. Yet its presence revealed how American logistical depth exerted a subtle but real influence on the management of surrendered enemies. U.S. policy, shaped by adherence to the Geneva Convention and by practical concerns, increasingly emphasized humane treatment as a means of maintaining order and extracting reliable labor from captive populations. In this framework, stable hydration and adequate nutrition were not kindnesses but tools that reduced illness, prevented unrest, and kept work detachments functional. Lemonade fit neatly into this system. Its vitamin content supplemented diets, strained by wartime substitutions, and its sharp flavor encouraged regular fluid intake during the blistering summers of the American interior. The result was a healthier prisoner population that required fewer medical interventions and responded more predictably to daily routines. For Japanese prisoners, the psychological effect was even more pronounced. They had been conditioned to expect cruelty and deprivation, and the steady flow of flavored drinks contradicted everything military instruction had taught them. The unexpected comfort undermined resistance, leading some to accept camp regulations with less suspicion, while others reconsidered the broader strengths of the enemy that could afford such provisions even for captives. Interrogators later observed that many expressed astonishment at the material surplus surrounding them, evidence that American industry could sustain enormous global operations without visible strain. These shifting perceptions, born from something as simple as a sweetened beverage, become more meaningful when viewed alongside the seasonal adjustments and supply adaptations that shaped POW camp life as the war progressed. Even within a system as robust as the American wartime supply chain, lemonade in POW camps remained subject to the practical limits of season, transport, and shifting priorities. As autumn cooled the plains and deserts of the interior, consumption naturally declined, allowing camps to stretch existing stocks without formal rationing. Mess sergeants noted that prisoners drank far less during cold mornings in Wisconsin or Colorado, making it possible to reserve the powder for the hotter months ahead. But there were moments when the flow faltered. Rail delays during winter storms or priority shipments redirected toward frontline units occasionally left camps with only partial allotments. In these periods, kitchen staff sometimes diluted the mixture more heavily or substituted weak fruit drinks. Decisions that quietly revealed how swiftly prisoners had come to expect the beverage in its full strength. Some men who had once viewed the drink with suspicion now murmured disappointment when the flavor ran thin, an inversion of the assumptions they had carried into captivity. Work detachments added further strain. Agricultural camps in Iowa and Arkansas requested increased quantities during peak harvest, arguing that prisoners performing long hours in humid fields needed hydration beyond plain water. In contrast, guards in other regions observed that many prisoners preferred lemonade over coffee or cocoa, prompting minor adjustments in daily menus. These variations demonstrated both the flexibility and the limits of American logistics, abundant by global standards, yet still shaped by transportation bottlenecks, seasonal demands, and the widening commitments of 1945. Paradox: each brief shortage only reinforced the significance of the months when supplies had arrived without interruption, sharpening prisoner awareness of the material strength surrounding them. These nuances carry the narrative toward the war's end, when such memories lingered as symbols of captivity's unexpected character. When Japan announced its surrender in August 1945, and the long process of repatriation began, many Japanese prisoners left American soil carrying with them a collection of unexpected impressions, among them the memory of lemonade. For men who had entered captivity braced for starvation and abuse, that first chilled cup had marked the earliest moment when reality diverged sharply from imperial warnings. As the transports carried them eastward across the Pacific, some reflected on how the drink had become a symbol of an enemy whose industrial and agricultural power far exceeded anything they had been taught to imagine. The ease with which American camps provided flavored beverages to captives, even as Japan endured shortages of rice and salt, offered a stark metric of the imbalance that had shaped the war's end. Others remembered the lemonade less as a symbol and more as a sensory anchor during a disorienting period, the sharp sweetness cutting through the uncertainty of captivity, the bright flavor contrasting with the austerity that awaited them in the shattered cities of home. In post-war memoirs and oral histories, references to the drink surfaced as small but telling markers of American abundance, glimpses into the logistical machinery that had supported not only vast armies, but also the men who had fought against them. Although lemonade left no technical legacy in the Reconstruction years, its presence in those camps revealed the deep connection between food logistics, prisoner morale, and the psychological reshaping that captivity imposed. As Japan rebuilt and wartime narratives were reconsidered, memories of such modest encounters helped former soldiers reassess the character and capability of the enemy they once viewed through the narrow lens of propaganda. These reflections returned the documentary to the moment when the story began. Desert afternoon, a steel dispenser, and the first astonished sip that overturned years of certainty. On that furnace-bright afternoon in July 1944, The moment that now frames the entire story unfolded almost without notice. The newly arrived prisoners at Camp Lordsburg, still coated in the dust of transport and the bitterness of defeat, approached the steel dispenser set beside the mess tables with a mixture of suspicion and quiet scorn. The pale yellow liquid glimmering inside seemed to confirm everything they had been told, that Americans were soft, wasteful, and foolish enough to indulge in luxuries, even in wartime. Under the hard press of the desert sun, with heat radiating off the sand and the air trembling with dust motes, they braced themselves for the humiliation they expected: thin rations, harsh treatment, and the slow erosion of dignity that imperial instructors had promised would follow. Surrender. Then the first sip broke through all of it. Coldness spread across tongues, parched from weeks of combat and deprivation. The sharp acidity jolting men who had forgotten the taste of citrus. The sweetness lingering in a way that felt impossible inside a prison camp. The laughter faded. The disbelief remained. What they had marked a heartbeat earlier became the first quiet sign that captivity in the United States would not conform to the grim warnings recited in barracks and caves across the Pacific. As weeks became months, Lemonade shifted from curiosity to routine. Yet the memory of that initial shock stayed with them, a reminder of the distance between expectation and reality, between the Japan they had left and the world they were now forced to confront. In the vast machinery of global war, a cup of lemonade was a trivial thing, yet for these men, it offered the first hint of the industrial strength, cultural difference, and unexpected humanity shaping their new existence. The documentary closes where it began, at the first pitcher in the desert heat, acknowledging that even the smallest ration can rewrite a worldview when tasted at the right moment.